Hi, this is Mrs. Kilkenny, and this is my lecture on natural selection. Let's get started with a little vocabulary. First of all, evolution. Evolution is the process in which populations change over time. This term populations is very important. We're not talking about individuals changing over time. We're talking about whole populations changing over several generations, and we'll give you some examples of that. Adaptations. What are adaptations? They're a characteristic that helps an organism survive and reproduce in the environment. We've talked about several of these, such as giraffes having a longer neck to reach more food, animals that live in cold environments having thicker fur, large paws on, for instance, the desert elephant or the polar bear that help them walk in the snow or the sand. All of these are adaptations that help those animals survive in their environment and reproduce more, therefore passing along more of their genes to the next generation. A species, what is a species? It's a group of organisms that can mate with one another to produce viable offspring. And that word viable offspring means an offspring that is also fertile. For example, we've talked about the horse and the donkey. These two are very closely related and can mate and have offspring, but that offspring, the mule, is not viable. Mules are not fertile. They cannot reproduce. This is an example of being from a different species. The horse and the donkey are from two different species. What is natural selection? Natural selection is the process by which organisms are better adapted to their environment, survive, and reproduce more successfully, thus passing down more of their fit phenotypes. Now, one of the great examples of this is the peppered moth from England. And the usual form of the peppered moth in Northern Europe was a light peppered pattern coloration. And if you look really closely, this moth right here, you can barely see him against the white trees. Its color pattern camouflages it against predatory attack. The camouflage only works against the right background. The birds are more likely to eat poorly camouflaged moths, and therefore they have a lower fitness. For example, this black moth over here has a poorer fitness because he stands out. So he's going to be eaten first, and therefore he's going to reproduce less and not pass on this black peppered trait. So the light coloration of the tree branches in England is mainly caused by lichens that grow there. And the smoke pollution in the Industrial Revolution in the UK killed these lichens in the industrial areas, leaving the tree branches black. If you look up here, you can see these black tree branches. At about this time, scientists started noticing that these moth populations started changing from the white speckled variety to a black speckled variety. And this black speckled form is camouflaged on the dark tree branches. And through the 19th century, this black speckled form increased in frequency until near industrial regions it was the normal type of moth. So the population almost completely changed from this white speckled variety you see right here, to this black speckled variety you see right here. This is a classic example of natural selection. Something in the environment was selecting against this white speckled moth and selecting for the black speckled moth. And so the population frequency went from a very high frequency of white speckled moths to a very high frequency of black speckled moths. All right, so there's a couple things we need for natural selection. And the one big thing here is we need to have a variation in traits. And we talked about this in genetics. There's lots of different traits out there. And when we have a variation in traits, the environment will prefer one over the other, and therefore that becomes more popular in the population. Now, we also need there to be differential reproduction, meaning not all individuals will survive to reproduce, and that's just a basic fact of life. Not all individuals grow to adulthood and reproduce. A lot of this is because maybe they don't have the correct genes to help get them to adulthood. Now, number 3 is we need heredity. We need to pass along the more fit or the more adapted, the more well-adapted genes need to be able to be passed on to the next generation. And of course, this process continues and continues and continues until eventually we have populations that are all the same color. For instance, in this speckled moth example, eventually if this process of evolution continued, this white speckled moth would have completely died out and we would have just had the black speckled moth. Now, this is not what happened. Actually, after the Industrial Revolution in the 20th century, they started cleaning up the factories and cleaning up the air. The white lichen came back, and now we're seeing a decrease in the black speckled variety and an increase in the white speckled variety. So again, this is kind of that push and pull of natural selection. So let's look at some other examples here. The evolution of antibiotic-resistant bacteria is one of the best examples of natural selection because the process takes place much quicker than the evolution of larger animals due to the rapid reproduction of bacteria. Effects and changes can be seen sooner since bacteria go through several generations in just a single day, whereas some animals take over 10 years for one generation. So how do antibiotic-resistant bacteria evolve? The process is quite simple. Say you have an infection and you are prescribed a treatment program consisting of antibiotics. You take the pills and they kill off most of the bacteria to the point where you're feeling better, so you stop taking the antibiotics. However, not 100% of the bacteria was killed. In fact, maybe some of the bacteria had genes that made them somewhat resistant to the medication. In other words, maybe some of the bacteria was tougher than the rest. These tougher bacteria were the only ones that survived, which means they will now be the ones reproducing and create a new population full of bacteria very similar to themselves, tough bacteria. Now you have a brand new population of bacteria and they have those same tough genes, which means they are going to be harder to kill and therefore more resistant to antibiotics. That effect continues from generation to generation until they become so resistant that medications may be rendered completely useless. And this is the reason why when you're prescribed an antibiotic, you need to make sure you take the entire prescription to make sure you get rid of all the bacteria in your system. Because if you leave some behind, those will come back and may be more resistant. The Red Queen effect, or the Red Queen hypothesis, refers to the idea that predators and prey are constantly taking part in an evolutionary race in order to keep up with each other's new adaptations. One good example of this can be seen in the struggle between camouflage and eyesight. If a prey develops exceptional camouflage, then only predators with good eyesight may be able to spot the prey. As a result, the predators will evolve better eyesight over the generations. Then, since the predators evolve better eyesight and can see their camouflage prey more easily, the prey will then continue to evolve better camouflage in response to the improved eyes of their predators. It is a constant evolutionary battle between predator and prey, with each side continuously evolving some kind of adaptation to stay ahead of the other. Pesticide-resistant insects are also a great example of natural selection. The theory is that when insects are sprayed with pesticides, it will kill all of the insects that are vulnerable or greatly affected by the chemicals. However, due to genetic diversity or variation, there may potentially be a few insects that are not affected too severely by the pesticides and may survive the encounter. Since all of the insects were severely affected by the pesticides have now died, that means that the surviving insects are somewhat resistant to the pesticides and will reproduce. Their reproduction will establish a new population consisting of insects that share the gene that allows them to survive contact with otherwise harmful chemicals. The result is pesticide-resistant insects. In order to kill the pesticide-resistant insects, you must create new pesticide. This leads us back to the Red Queen effect, which is that we are constantly having to develop new pesticides to help deal with the ever-evolving insects that we're trying to kill. All of these are good examples of natural selection, and we'll talk about some more in class. Let me know if you have any questions.